Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Robert Allen, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Major General Wade Stothart. Today, we commemorate the 50th anniversary of Australia's withdrawal from Vietnam. Australia made its first military commitment to Vietnam in 1962, deploying a small team of military advisors, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, to assist in the training of South Vietnamese forces. By 1965, the AATV had expanded to 100 soldiers. As the US escalated its involvement, the Australian government followed suit, committing the first Australian combat troops to South Vietnam. The 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment and Support Forces arrived in May 1965. When its tour ended in mid-1966, the Australian commitment expanded to an independent task force of 2 battalions with combat and logistics support. The 1st Australian Task Force established its base at Nui Dat in the heart of the southern province of Phuoc Tuy and quickly made impressive gains. In early 1968, the task force increased in size and effectiveness with the addition of a 3rd Manoeuvre Battalion and a tank squadron. With casualties continuing to mount and no end in sight, public support suffered, and the war became a focal point of intense social and political dissent. By late 1970, a wind-down and withdrawal of the forces was underway as the US government began to implement a policy of Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing forces to leave the war in the hands of the South Vietnamese. The last Australian battalion left Nui Dat in November 1971. Whilst a handful of advisors remained, in December 1972, they became the last Australian troops to come home, with the unit having seen service in South Vietnam for over a decade. Some 60,000 Australians served in the war, and at its peak strength, the Australian force in Vietnam comprised elements from all 3 services. But for Australia, Vietnam was predominantly a ground war. The Army did most of the fighting and most of the dying. Australian soldiers were placed into longer periods of contact or imminent risk of contact with the enemy than perhaps at any time since the Gallipoli campaign of 1915. More than 3,000 were wounded and 521 soldiers were killed. Today, we remember those who fought in Vietnam. We pay our respects to the men and women commemorated here on the Roll of Honour and to the survivors who returned home. Today, we warmly welcome the family of Sapper Ian Neil Scott, whose story will be told shortly. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. The live stream of this ceremony is made possible by the Return and Services League of Australia and the RSL and Services Clubs Association. We welcome members who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by family and visitors to the memorial. Australia's Federation Guard is the tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catafalque party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. If you are able, please stand and join in singing the national anthem. If able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament. Flowers of the forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Sapper Ian Neil Scott. Ian Scott was born in Charleville, Queensland on the 26th of September 1948, the son of Alex and Mona Scott. Scott grew up in the Ipswich suburb of Brassall, where he attended Brighton State School and Ipswich State High School. He attained his sub-junior certificate at the end of 1962 and became an apprentice carpenter at the age of 14. Over the next 3.5 years, he learned his trade and attended Ipswich Technical School. He left his apprenticeship 3.5 years later and worked as a slaughterman at an abattoir and as a station hand. He had returned to work at the abattoir when his call-up for national service arrived. After passing his initial testing, he joined the Australian Army on the 22nd of April 1969. With a keen interest in motorbikes and engines, he asked to be posted to transport or engineering. Selected for training with the Royal Australian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, he was sent to the 3rd Training Battalion at Singleton. By September, Scott had qualified as a field engineer and became part of the Royal Australian Engineers reinforcement pool for service in South Vietnam. Scott flew out of Sydney on the 28th of October and arrived at Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon the following day. He was then flown to the main Australian base at Nui Dat, where he was taken on strength of 2 Troop, 1 Field Squadron Royal Australian Engineers. Operations were constant and the climate took its toll on Scott, who was hospitalised on New Year's Eve suffering from heat exhaustion. The main task for 1 Field Troop was the clearing of the barrier minefield between Dat Do and the coast. Although it is unclear if Scott was involved in those activities that day, he returned to his unit in early January 1970. Scott was given leave in April, which he spent at home in Australia. After returning to South Vietnam, he was soon back in the field. On the 12th of June, Scott was deployed as part of a 2-man engineer splinter team with 7 RAR on Operation Kun Chung, a reconnaissance and ambush operation conducted in cooperation with the province chief of Phuoc Tuy province. On the 14th of June, 7 RAR was operating in the southeast of Phuoc Tuy province near the coastal village of Lang Phoc Hai. Scott was attached to an infantry section travelling aboard an armoured personnel carrier, call sign 21 Alpha. With the threat of the mines ever present, the men travelled on top of the armoured personnel carrier in an attempt to minimise casualties from mine strikes. Just after 3 p.m, the armoured personnel carrier struck a large anti-tank mine. The resulting blast wounded the driver and the crew commander of the armoured personnel carrier and a 7 RAR soldier. Scott, who was sitting on the front of the vehicle, was killed instantly. His remains were returned to Australia, where they were laid to rest in Charleville General Cemetery. Ian Scott was 21 years old. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on your right, along with more than 500 others from the Vietnam War. His photograph is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of courage and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Sapper Ian Neil Scott, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
we will remember them.
Catapult party, present, arms. Catapult party, shoulder, arms.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Catapult party in Catapult party, wick, up.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the director, staff and volunteers, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support of the Memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you.